well as the slides after the presentation today. If there are questions that we aren't able to get to or that you don't want to ask in the full group, there will be contact information on the final slide for all of the presenters. Our agenda today spans everything from appropriations and financial aid to workforce development, campus safety, and free speech. And we are going to start with an overview of funding trends and financial aid from Dustin Whedon at the State Higher Education Executive Officers. So Dustin, I will turn it over to you.
All right, thank you, Siri. It's a great pleasure to be a part of this webinar for the third year in a row, and I actually have a lot of content to cover, so I'm going to dive right into some trends on state higher education appropriations and financial aid. So advancing to my first slide that has a figure, this figure shows the annual percent change in state higher education general fund expenditures between fiscal year 2015 and 2020. And as you can see, there's been a fair amount of volatility in state funding the last few years, with state funding increases ranging from about 2% to nearly 5% between 2015 and 2019. Now, the good news, though, is based on early indications, is that at least nationally, higher education funding is expected to increase by nearly 5.5% during the current fiscal year. And this is the largest percent increase in going back at least 5 years. I do want to mention that at least for the 2020 numbers here, these are very preliminary, and of course, a lot of factors can change that expected increase over the next 12 months. So advancing to my next slide, we see the nearly 5.5% increase compares to other major budget categories. And as this figure shows, the expected increase in general fund support for higher education actually outpaces the other major budget categories of corrections, K-12, and Medicaid spending. So the next slide kind of puts the fiscal year 2020 percent increase in higher education funding in a broader perspective, with percent increase data for each of the major budget categories over the last 3 budget cycles. And as you can see, higher education funding, which is the green bar, has fared better than most other budget categories the last 2 years, after lagging K-12 education, which is the blue bar, Medicaid funding, the yellow bar, and corrections, the red bar, by nearly 2% in 2018. I think it's also worth noting on this slide that Medicaid funding has, on average, outpaced higher education funding by 1 percentage point in each of these 3 budget years. So on the next slide, I just want to highlight a couple of state budget trends before moving on to financial aid. Well, there's a lot of discussion about a recession in the near future. State revenues have actually been very strong and growing over the last couple of years. And the major tax sources, general sales tax and income tax, have actually been very strong and expected to grow at a decent rate, I think about 3.5% to 4% for each of those categories. But of course, these projections will change dramatically if we do see an economic downturn or significant changes in state financial health. So now I'll move on to some trends in state financial aid. And so unlike general higher education appropriations, state financial aid has consistently increased over time. On a per student basis, state financial aid appropriations have increased nearly 103% since 2000, going from about $370 to over $750 per student during this time period. And the most recent year that we have data between 2017 and 2018, financial aid appropriations per student increased nearly 9%. So on the next slide, the blue bars will show the financial aid per student for every year between 2000 and 2018. The interesting trend here is that financial aid per student has steadily increased and does not show the same volatility that general appropriations do. During the worst years of the Great Recession between 2008 and 2012, financial aid increased 7.1%, while general appropriations dropped by over 24%. As a result, financial aid has actually increased as a percent of higher education appropriations, going from about 6.5% to 9.3%, which you can kind of see in the red line during the recession period. And then going back to 2000, state financial aid has actually increased from about 4% to over 9.5% of state funding. And then I'm going to just wrap up with my next slide. So in general, states are protecting financial aid during economic downturns and increasing state aid at a faster rate than general operating support. And I just want to highlight the changes in Washington's financial aid program this past year. And I think this kind of shows the type of support states are, or type of attention states are paying to financial aid, and a pretty significant increase in state funding. So Washington is actually known for having a very high quality financial aid program, but nearly 20,000 students who qualified for the state need grant did not receive aid due to lack of funding. So this year, through legislation, the state updated their need-based program and actually changed the name to be the Washington College Grant. And now this program guarantees all students from families with incomes up to 55% of the median family income will receive enough aid to cover tuition and fees, and all families up to the state's median family income will receive aid through the program. And all students are eligible, including part-time and adult students. And they're expanding the aid so it covers more than your traditional associate-seeking students and baccalaureate-seeking students. Registered apprenticeships will be eligible for this aid program starting next year. And so with that, I will turn it back over to Siri, and we can keep moving along and learn more about financial.
Great, thank you, Dustin. And you're now actually going to hand over the floor to Andrew Smalley with the National Conference of State Legislatures to dig in a little bit more to student loan debt and state promise programs.
Thanks, Siri. So yeah, I'm going to cover a little bit about the legislative tracking that we've been doing here at the National Conference of State Legislatures related to student loan debt and state promise programs. So if we can go to the next slide, we'll start with just a little background on student loan debt. In 2018, the collective student loan debt by U.S. students totaled over $1.5 trillion. That debt's distributed among 44 million borrowers who on average owed just over $32,000 each. Research from the Brookings Institute suggests that nearly 40% of these borrowers may default on their student loans by 2023. And it's important to also note that borrowing levels and default rates vary drastically by institution type. And a recent report from the Federal Reserve found that 20% of the decline in home ownership for young adults could be attributed to increasing student loan debt levels. And it's also important to remember that student loan debt does not just impact young people. More than 2.8 million Americans over the age of 60 have taken out at least one student loan, often to support a family member's education. So in 2019, NCSL tracked over 275 bills related to student loans specifically. And so if we could go to the next slide, I'll show a map that categorizes that legislation into our sort of four main big categories, which is student loan forgiveness programs, student loan tax credits or tax deductions, student loan servicing oversight, and easing default consequences for student loans. We've seen the most introduced and enacted legislation related to student loan forgiveness programs, and we've seen a lot of activity in the past year related to student loan oversight. So if we go to the next slide, we'll look specifically at forgiveness programs. States generally structure these programs in similar ways, allowing borrowers who work in certain professions or fields to receive partial or complete loan forgiveness after working for a period of time. So since 2015, we tracked 46 bills in 26 states addressing student loan forgiveness programs, and there was a significant uptick of activity in 2019, 21 bills enacted in 16 states. So the most common type of student loan forgiveness legislation we see is profession-based programs, providing forgiveness to workers in select fields of employment. The most common professions we see are healthcare workers and educators. So in 2019, programs for healthcare workers were slightly more common than educators. We're also seeing states begin to explore and create student loan forgiveness programs as part of broader talent and residency retention bills. For example, we saw New Hampshire create the groundwork for a residency-based program in 2019 with Senate Bill 12. And we've also seen some states provide tax credit and tax deductions for student loan payments. These credits are often provided to employers who agree to help make payments on their employees' student loans. For example, Connecticut Senate Bill 72 creates a tax credit of up to 50% for payments made on a student's or an employee's education loan. If we can go to the next slide, we'll talk a bit about student loan oversight legislation. which include bills that create new rules and regulations for student loan servicers, as well as bills to provide information and assistance to student borrowers who might be confused by the loan repayment process. Several states have also created student loan ombudsman offices that are tasked with handling repayment issues and borrower complaints. Many of these bills are commonly called student loan borrower bill of rights legislation, which first passed in Connecticut in 2015. Since then, 13 other states have enacted similar legislation. And in 2019 alone, 19 states introduced similar legislation, and 7 states enacted bills related to student loan servicing oversight. We go to the next slide. We'll get into the last category of student loan legislation, which is bills that modify professional license or suspension laws for student loan defaults. And 5 states enacted legislation in that category this year. One example of these bills is Texas Senate Bill 37, which prohibits student loan default as grounds for refusal to renew an occupational license. There's also pending legislation in California that would prohibit schools from refusing to provide a transcript to current or former students on the grounds that that student owes a debt. So if we go to the next slide, we'll shift a bit to state promise programs, which have been discussed a lot, and several states have already created these programs or are making modifications to these programs. These programs vary a lot from state to state, but they generally involve a state commitment to cover tuition costs for students who graduate from local public high schools. And states are exploring different ways to design and manage these programs. This includes whether to make promise programs tuition-free or debt-free, whether to provide first dollar or last dollar scholarships, which institutions, 2 years or 4 years or both, and which students will be covered. Overall, 18 states and more than 350 localities across 44 states have some form of promise program. And if you go to the next slide, you can see that in 2019, 22 states considered legislation related to promise programs, and 7 states enacted legislation addressing a promise program. Not all these bills are creating promise programs. Like I mentioned, many of these are expanding or modifying existing programs to change the eligibility, scope, or funding of the program. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Siri.
Great, thanks, Andrew. And for those of you sending questions, thank you. We will we'll come back to those at the end, and to everyone who's listening along. If you've joined us late, feel free, if you have questions along the way, to plug those into the webinar chat, and we will come back to them at the Q&A time at the end. So at this point, we're going to turn it back over to Shio and have Eric, who's the Associate Vice President there, talk a little bit about community colleges.
Thanks, Siri. I'm going to talk briefly about the community college sector and a few topics that are impacting institutions, state systems, and leading national conversations about community colleges and their role in training America's workforce. But I think it's important to note that these topics have expanded well beyond the community college sector now and are being incorporated in the four-year institutions and systems. In particular, I will talk about guided pathways, math pathways redesign, and then close with a more open-ended overview of the concepts of credential expansion and educational attainment. For all of these topics, my goal is to provide a quick overview of a few key elements, and each topic has a link to at least one recent resource that can provide you with more information. So let's begin with guided pathways. In 2015, researchers from the Community College Research Center outlined a new approach to increasing the effectiveness of community colleges and improving student success rates. This guided pathways model has since become a signature component of reform efforts by individual institutions, state systems, and national higher education organizations, including the American Association of Community Colleges, Achieving the Dream, and Jobs for the Future. A guided pathways approach attempts to better understand the educational goals of incoming students, educate students on future career and educational opportunities associated with specific academic pathways, help students select appropriate academic program plans, and then monitor and support students all the way to program completion. In particular, the model incorporates 4 elements that focus on providing students with clear college to career pathways, with the necessary academic and student service supports to monitor progress. First, the development of program maps to connect a student from college entry to completion, identifying program requirements, and providing a student with information on careers and transfer information. Second, helping students choose and enter a program pathway by providing career exploration opportunities and assisting the student with academic and financial planning and support. Third, keeping students on path with intrusive advising, feedback, progress monitoring, and predictable scheduling. Finally, ensuring students are learning through active and experimental learning and targeted learning outcomes. In their recent publication, CCRC studied 8 early adopters of guided pathways and lay out 4 steps to successful implementation, which include laying the groundwork, introducing the topic of guided pathways, supporting collaborative planning and implementation, and sustaining and institutionalizing student success reforms. We can go to the next slide. And it's important to recognize that the idea of guided pathways is not a quick fix or a simple implementation. This is an approach that's really a total transformation from the idea of a college-centered environment to a student-centered environment. Therefore, as CCRC outlines, it can take as long as 6 years for full implementation after the groundwork has already been established, which may take a few years for that initial foundation. We can go to the next slide. The second topic I wanted to highlight is math pathways redesign. Math is currently being identified as the main barrier to college success by a number of national organizations and researchers, including the Dana Center out of the University of Texas at Austin, one of the leaders in national math reform. And this argument comes from 3 factors. First, long course sequences mean some students never finish the required math for their credential. The U.S. Department of Education reports that 70% of students in developmental education do not enroll in credit-bearing mathematics courses. In addition, almost half of students in credit math courses fail. Second, there is a mismatch of content with an emphasis on pathways structured around the goal of calculus, which most students do not need. Instead, math courses should be structured around a student's major and focus on algebra and calculus, if needed, quantitative reasoning, or statistics. Finally, there is a growing body of research showing that developmental education tests are inaccurate in how they place students, and that with the right supports, students can pass gateway level courses. The Dana Center focuses their work on 4 principles. The first 2 elements, students entering math aligned with their program of study, that they complete their first math course in their first year, align well with the idea of guided pathways and a lot of the Complete College America strategies. The idea here is to get students into math and their major requirements from the start, so it doesn't take them a year before they are earning college level credit, and they can become inspired by taking courses in their major of study. The final 2 elements for success incorporate principles for aligning strategies across the institution and utilizing evidence-based approaches. Next slide. This image is a great example of the issues highlighted by the developmental education math sequence. Using Achieving the Dream Colleges, this image shows the starting point in math for over 63,000 students who were recommended to need at least 3 levels of remedial math. After 3 years, only 11% passed the gateway math course. So you can imagine poor overall completion rates when you extend this trajectory to degree or certificate completion. Next slide. The final piece I wanted to talk about are 2 topics that are closely tied together: the idea of credential expansion in community colleges and educational attainment. Over the past few years, pushed in part by the work of Lumina Foundation's A Stronger Nation on state educational attainment levels, and the work of Georgetown University's Center on Education in the Workforce, showing the importance of higher education credentials for the future workforce, educational attainment is a hot topic helping bridge the gap between post-secondary education and the workforce, with community colleges being on the front lines. You can see from this chart that attainment has increased by 10 percentage points from 2008, due in part because workforce relevant certificates were added to this calculation in 2014. There was a lot of work going on in the credentialing space, including looking at apprenticeships, third-party certifications, and other non-degree credentials, especially short-term certificates. At the same time, wage studies are being conducted to determine how much benefit different credentials add to a person's income. As this work continues, it will be important for colleges and state systems to keep an eye on it and see how this information can be applied at the local, state, and national levels. Thank you, and I'll turn it back over to Siri.
Awesome, thanks, Eric. And I am going to sort of build on that and talk a little bit about the connecting post-secondary and workforce development, I think, which is driving a lot of the conversation around credentials. So based on our tracking here at Education Commission of the states, we've identified 27 states that enacted at least 52 pieces of legislation connecting post-secondary and workforce development. Two states that are noted in this map in orange actually passed legislation, but the bills were then vetoed by the governor. So I'm just going to talk about a few of the trends and highlight some state examples for each of those trends. If you're curious and would like to learn more about legislation in particular states that I don't talk about, you can use our state policy tracking tool at ecs.org. So the legislation passed in 2019 on this topic covered a variety of sort of themes, and we have identified these three common themes. The first being partnerships and working groups, and these bills frequently hit on membership of boards, commissions, councils, the creation of task forces, or just requirements or directives for collaboration across systems. The second theme is financial incentives. So this would include grants, financial aid, loan forgiveness to students for degrees or certification in high demand fields, as well as funding incentives to institutions for program development or equipment. And then a third theme that we saw come up quite a bit is career pathways and skills. So activity here included the creation of targeted programs or recruitment strategies for specific populations, creation of targeted programs, creation of credential programs, and connecting post-secondary education to workforce needs and specific occupational fields in the states. Often the legislation touched on specifically on career and technical education, apprenticeships, and work-based learning as important strategies to making the education and employment connection. Certainly many pieces of legislation hit on multiple of these themes. In particular, there were quite a few bills that provide financial incentives for development of or participation in career pathways. So next, I will talk about a few examples for each of these categories. At least 10 bills that we saw created commissions, task forces, or advisory councils. And many other bills included language directing state agencies, including post-secondary and workforce agencies, to work with each other, work with private business and industry, work with K-12 and other local partners. Whether they are formally created through a task force, council, or commission, or informally through directed collaboration, these partnerships are generally charged with the alignment, creation, and refinement of career pathways, coordinating with industry to train workers to fill in-demand jobs, and setting statewide post-secondary attainment goals, and or developing and implementing strategies to reach those attainment goals. So a few examples to highlight. North Carolina enacted House Bill 664, which establishes their statewide attainment goal of 2 million residents between the ages of 25 to 44 having a high quality credential or post-secondary degree by 2030. The bill also requires the My Future NC Commission to report to the General Assembly on progress toward that goal and make policy recommendations to the Joint Legislative Task Force on Post-Secondary Attainment. In Connecticut, Senate Bill 607 requires the Labor Department and Board of Regents for Higher Education to implement a plan that will establish pathways for individuals who complete an apprenticeship to earn credit towards a bachelor's degree at a state university. And West Virginia's House Bill 2004 requires the State Board of Education, the Council for Community and Technical Colleges Education, and Department of Commerce to coordinate to collect information on CTE and share information with parents and students. The bill also creates the Community and Technical College Career Education Consortia, and these locally based consortia will each include representatives from community and technical colleges, public CTE centers, and post-secondary institutions offering associate's degrees. The consortia are charged with collaborating with other entities as well and increasing coordination and alignment between secondary and post-secondary education to meet workforce needs. Moving on to financial incentives, at least 23 states passed legislation that provide financial incentives to support workforce development needs. These incentives were in the form of grants, financial aid, or loan forgiveness for students pursuing degrees or certifications in high demand areas, funding to institutions for program development or equipment, as well as tax credits or other incentives for employers who participate in employer-sponsored training, including apprenticeships. So in Mississippi, Senate Bill 3015 appropriated $6.75 million to support workforce development centers and advanced training centers to defray startup costs for programs and replace obsolete equipment at community and junior colleges. The bill also included $3 million for the State Community Colleges Board to enroll low-skill adults in career pathways that combine high school equivalency, skills training, and workforce credentials. Senate Bill 60 in Montana revises the state's STEM scholarship, including defining the goal of the program as connecting students to current and future workforce development needs in the state. The STEM scholarship is a graduated scholarship for students majoring in STEM or healthcare fields, and it increases in value as students complete more credit hours, up to $2,000 per year in the fourth year. And then finally in this section, Wyoming Senate File 122 establishes the Wyoming Works program through the community college system. Wyoming Works provides funding to Wyoming's community colleges to support credential programs that meet regional workforce needs, as well as $3 million for scholarships for enrolled students. One interesting thing on this bill, prospective students do not necessarily need a high school diploma or high school equivalency to be eligible, so it provides an opportunity to re-engage disconnected youth or adults in education. Next slide. Legislative activity around career pathways included the creation of targeted programs or recruitment strategies for specific populations, the creation of credential programs, and connecting post-secondary education to work-based learning to develop, to workforce development needs. So a few examples here. Colorado's HB 1294 requires the Colorado Community College System to convene a working group to determine the best way to transfer construction industry registered apprenticeship program credit to college credit, and also consider the feasibility of all community colleges offering registered apprenticeship programs and how that coursework can articulate to progress toward a degree. In Alabama, Senate Bill 295 establishes the Alabama Office of Apprenticeship and requires the new office to work with other education and workforce stakeholders to align instruction and CTE programs to regional and statewide in-demand careers. And Tennessee's House Bill 740 and Companion Bill Senate Bill 1259 creates a statewide definition for work-based learning and designates the Tennessee Higher Education Commission as the agency to administer work-based learning grants for eligible work-based learning programs. In order to be eligible, students in qualified programs must also be earning academic credit. All right, and now I'm going to hand over the floor to Thomas Harnish, Director of State Policy Relations and Policy Analysis at the American Association of State Colleges and Universities.
Thank you, Suri. And thank you all for joining us this afternoon. I'd like to talk about two issues that have got on increasingly on legislative calendars in recent years. Is that the issue of student campus safety as well as free speech on campus. So if we could go to the first slide. On combating campus sexual assault, there have been a number of states in this legislative session that have passed legislation related to campus sexual assault. But one contextual point of information is that the U.S. Department of Education is currently going through the rulemaking process on Title IX, and they have proposed new Title IX regulations that would pertain to campus sexual assault. They are currently reviewing over 100,000 comments to their proposed regulations, and they will be responding to those comments. And we expect later this year the final regulations coming from the U.S. Department of Education. And that's important because that could conflict with some of the state level laws and regulations that have passed this year and in recent years. For example, the most sweeping measure on campus sexual assault prevention this year was out of the state of Texas, a package of bills signed by Governor Greg Abbott to crack down on campus sexual assault and misconduct. Just a few of the key points from those bills is one is that they will have new clear definitions of inappropriate behavior that will now be in state law. That's important because those definitions would actually be in conflict with the proposed regulations to Title IX. Again, we're waiting on the final regulations, but those in the Texas law would, as of right now, would be in conflict with the changes to Title IX. Second is new transcript notations that would these are marks that we put on campus, be put on university transcripts for students who have been removed from campus for non-academic reasons. So not just campus sexual assault, but also could be other reasons that they have been expelled from campus. And then lastly, on university employees who do not report misconduct to Title IX administrators could be charged with a state misdemeanor charge, as well as potentially face termination. So Texas is a state that has really been aggressive in this legislative session in trying to combat campus sexual assault. Another state, Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania has been, under Governor Tom Wolf, has been active on this issue, and they have approved legislation in this session to create a new online portal for anonymous reporting of campus sexual assault. So all colleges and universities in the state will be required soon to have an online portal. Louisiana, they have wanted to increase the number of respondents to campus climate surveys. So they passed a law that will require campus climate surveys to be distributed every 3 years. And then one other state that I would point your attention to is the state of Utah. Utah has been active on this topic in this legislative session in response to the death of a student on campus. So now in Utah, all of the institutions of higher education will now have to create a campus safety plan that spells out the rights of victims of sexual assault and point them in the direction, victims of sexual assault, dating violence, and domestic violence, and directs them to available resources. And they also pass legislation spelling out how institutions can engage with law enforcement in cases of campus sexual violence where they find an articulable and significant threat on campus. And they can pass along information to authorities, to law enforcement authorities, even if the victim has not approved of them providing the information. But this bill does maintain confidentiality It provides a victim the notice that they are engaging in law enforcement, and it tries to limit the information available. So, so those are a few of the bills that have passed in this session related to campus sexual assault. We can go to the next slide. Free speech on campus. This issue has really gained steam in the last few years, particularly in conservative among conservative lawmakers, concerned that that campuses are abridging the right of students to exercise their First Amendment rights, particularly students with conservative viewpoints. So bills have been introduced throughout the country. And in the 2019 legislative sessions, bills have been signed into law in Alabama, Arkansas, Iowa, Kentucky, North Dakota, Oklahoma, and Texas. And those were all GOP governors signing those bills into law. In Montana, the legislature also passed a free speech bill, but the governor there, a Democrat, Steve Bullock, actually vetoed the legislation, arguing that the current law was appropriate, and that the new law, the legislation would actually weaken free speech on college campuses. Now, it's important to remember with free speech on campus that states cannot make changes to the First Amendment. First Amendment is in the U.S. Constitution, and it has been clarified through case law over the years. But states cannot make changes to the First Amendment, and public colleges and universities are fully subjected to the First Amendment. Now, there, of course, there are exceptions for time, place, and manner, and most of these bills make exceptions to time, place, and manner. These bills, by and large, simply restate current case law as it pertains to free speech on college campuses. But each bill is a little different, but generally they restate case law, but they also prohibit free speech zones on college campus. So there's concern that they are quarantining campus speech to certain areas of campus. So they want to make the entire campus a free speech zone, obviously subject to restrictions on time, place, and manner, as well as some of these bills have reporting requirements to college and university boards related to instances of free speech on campus and whether free speech rights were potentially abridged on certain college campuses in the state. So those are some of the states that have been active on the free speech on issue campus. If we just go to our next slide, just to learn more about these issues and other state higher education policy issues, I do want to put a plug in for our 2019 Higher Education Government Relations Conference. That is going to be December 4th through the 6th in New Orleans, Louisiana. And this conference we discuss a lot about state higher education policy and state higher education policy trends, but we also talk about advocacy strategies that have been successful, advocacy strategies that you can use in your state to advance the higher education agenda. So that is December 4th to the 6th, 2019 in New Orleans, Louisiana. It's an open conference for everyone who wants to attend. And then lastly, if you want to really stay abreast of what's going on state higher education policy, we have the higher education policy headlines. This goes out at 9 a.m. Eastern every weekday morning. So that includes a mix of federal higher education policy headlines as well as state higher education policy headlines. And that's available to all who want it. And then we also put out our higher education policy brief series, and soon on state higher education policy issues. So the subscription form is right there. You can feel free to sign up for those for either of those products from ASCU. So with that, I'll turn it back to Suri.
Great. Thanks, Tom, and also thanks, Tom, for your leadership in making this webinar happen. So we just wanted to spend just a minute looking ahead to 2020 before we jump to Q&A. So just a reminder, if you have questions, please put them into the chat box. So thinking about 2020, really in contrast to the 2018 elections, which resulted in 20 new governors, 2 new education chiefs, many new state legislators, the off-year statewide elections happening in the fall of 2019 will probably not lead to major leadership changes. There are only 3 states that are holding gubernatorial elections and 4 states with regular legislative elections. So that stability in the leadership will likely mean that we'll see more of the same when it comes to the topics covered here and overall in higher education legislation. In terms of funding and budget items, 2019 was a budget year for most General Assemblies. So there may be less movement in funding for higher education, including financial aid and other big ticket budget items, particularly for those states that are not in a budget year. And finally, expect to see more on the topics of campus safety and free speech, at least to be introduced despite some of the low rates of enactment that Tom had mentioned. So with that, I want to shift to questions. And let's see, I think the first one I'm going to throw over to Andrew to expand a little bit on the numbers that you had up there around the average loan debt. So specifically, if 32,000 is an average debt figure for all borrowers or just bachelor's degree recipients, and if you have a breakdown of how much debt is with for-profit institutions versus public or private nonprofit. So Andrew, throw it over to you. I think you're unmuted.
Yeah, sure. So all those questions about the student loan data, all of that is, I think one question was, is that nationwide or statewide? It's nationwide data and all that's pulled from our legislators' toolkit on higher education, the paper on student loan debt that we did, which I'm happy to share the link to that in the chat, because that paper does have a lot more of the detailed data that I think some of you were looking at with, the borrowing by bachelor's degree versus graduate, by private versus public. So I'm happy to share that because I think you, in the questions, noted correctly that this borrowing levels do vary drastically, and also happy to answer more detailed data questions via email. Don't have all the data in front of me, but happy to share the link to that paper in the chat, which has some of that in there.
Great, thanks, Andrew. That would be super helpful. And we, as I mentioned at the beginning, we will send around the link for the recording and the slides, and we can also probably include some of these additional resources in that email to attendees after we wrap up here. We had a question about Colorado's, from the post-secondary workforce connection section, about Colorado's House Bill 1294 and why it isn't under the statewide coordinating entity. I'm not going to speak for the intent of the legislation, but I did want to clarify that the Colorado Community College system is the convening entity, so they are convening a working group to then advise the community college system, and then the working group must include representatives of community colleges, area technical schools, local district colleges, relevant four-year institutions, and applicable union and non-union labor organizations. So just a quick clarification on that one. Tom, it looks like there is a question about whether any states are considering requiring institutions not to ask about prior criminal history, sort of the ban the box issue, if you want to take a stab at that one.
Yes, sorry. Thank you, Fran, for the question. There was one state that I just saw that did pass, I believe, legislation on that. That's the state of Colorado about prior criminal history issues. But please note that as it relates to campus sexual assault, there are provisions in there that do include crime. That crimes of those magnitude do need to be reported. So it is, yes, there have been at least one state that I know of, and there's probably more that has legislated on that issue, but there are certain caveats as it pertains to some crimes.
Whoops, thanks, Tom. Let's see, Dustin and Eric, can you speak to any new trends from legislatures on performance-based funding? I'll unmute you there. Okay, go ahead.
So no, that's a very interesting question. And I think in general, what we've seen with performance funding, and I'd love for Andrew to weigh in on this too. He's probably tracked the legislation much closer lately than I have. But I think what we're seeing is like in most states who have enacted performance-based funding, the states who are going to do it have probably done it. And so we've probably seen in general like a slowdown. There hasn't been as many states adopting performance-based funding. And actually in some ways, we've seen a reverse. And the number of states have dropped performance-based funding in the last couple of years. So I don't know if there's any real trend line right there. It's probably, I think hold steady, probably somewhere around about 30 states have it in place. And it kind of varies a little bit based. I think probably what you're seeing more is actually states are refining their models and making tweaks based on several years of having implemented the program and kind of finding out where the problem areas are and making adjustments to have better models.
And yeah, I would just echo what Dustin said and add that if you are curious more about this and specifically on a state-by-state basis, we do have on our website the interactive database that my colleague Marilyn Villalobos maintains and updates, and that has a look at performance-based funding and base plus funding, enrollment funding. So if you are curious about that, I can certainly share that link as well.
Great. I think we have covered all the questions in the chat box, but I want to open it up to all the panelists if you have any final thoughts or issues that you wanted to put or resources you want to put a plug in for, or if you've seen a question in the chat box that I didn't cover.
Sir, there's some questions in the Q&A portion of this that we might want to be able to get to as well.
Thank you.
I know there's one here from Michael on the Title VI funding for the U.S. Department of Education. I actually haven't had a chance to review that yet, but I can I can try to send you an email and after I talk with our federal team about that issue on Title VI funding from the Higher Education Act. But yeah, I'm just not as I saw the headlines, but I haven't been able to kind of dig into that issue yet.
Great, and thank you for pointing out the Q&A section. I wasn't looking in that part of the platform. So let's turn to a couple of those questions. Is the student loan legislation that's being introduced a standard format across the states, or is there a particular organization pushing that legislation? Andrew, you want to take a stab at that?
Sure. If you're specifically asking about kind of the oversight, servicing oversight legislation, yes, many of these bills are fairly similar and kind of follow the Student Borrower Bill of Rights that was set up by Connecticut. They have similar provisions such as loan ombudsman and servicing regulations. In regards to the pushing aspect of it, we don't really track the lobbying associated with the bills. I know there are a few organizations nationwide that are advocating for those bills from a consumer protection angle, but don't have the list of specific organizations. And then I think just real quick above that, I saw Steve's note about New Hampshire and the New Hampshire bill, and that's correct about the that one does not have funding attached. If you're interested in a similar bill that does have funding attached, from 2018, Utah Senate Bill 104, and that created their talent development incentive loan program. So that's a bill similar that did have funding attached, but was passed in 2018, not 2019.
Thanks. And Andrew, also for you, your take on the promise programs that Democratic candidates for the presidency are proposing.
Right. So again, we focus on state policies and state legislation related to the promise programs and looking at how different states are kind of grappling with those issues. So don't really have any formal comments on those proposals other than to say several of the states have already created similar types of these programs, and states are already looking at many of these issues that are being discussed there.
It looks like we have one last question around what's happening with infrastructure funding. So Dustin and Eric or Andrew, you guys might be in the best position to answer questions about infrastructure funding for post-secondary.
Yeah, so it's a great question, and I would kind of put this as more capital funding, maybe a little bit broader. And there's a lot of challenges with getting and collecting capital funding data. And I would say right now we don't have a great data source, so it's kind of hard to really get a good handle of what's going on. NASBO does have some data that's a little bit delayed, and I think what you're seeing with their data is a fairly funding stream from states, which it does vary a lot state by state. So maybe take a look at NASBO data if you're interested in that topic. And I'd also just say that SHEO's State Higher Education Finance Report, we're currently going through a major update of that report and what we're going to start collecting, and capital funding is on that list, and we hope to start being able to collect that data in another year or two.
Great. Well, it looks like we have tackled all the questions that I have seen pop up. So I'm going to advance to the next slide. So here is the contact information for all of the panelists. I know everyone on here would be happy to continue dialogue on these topics with folks, and we will send out, once we get it posted and get the slides, the recording and the slides posted, we will send out a link to participants as well as some of these additional resources that have been mentioned. And then finally, I would just offer, I think the organizations that have been part of this today are excited to keep doing this on an annual basis, and so we would welcome feedback from those of you listening in as to how this went, what worked well as if there are topics that we didn't touch on that you'd like to hear more about next year. And we'll also, of course, be closely monitoring the legislative activity to see what's popping and what new issues are coming up. So with that, we will wrap up a little bit early. I want to thank all of the panelists for putting thought into this and making this happen, as well as all of you for participating and listening and asking great questions. We look forward to continuing the conversation next year and in between. So with that, thanks everybody, and have a great rest of your day.